This head is over 3,000 years old. It represents the king of gods, the god Amen, with the features of Tutankhamun, of the famous King Tut.
Acquired disease is this tiny little piece of bone. Some people call it Freiberg's disease. So this piece of bone becomes dead.
For 3 millennia, Tutankhamun's truth slept beneath gold and resin while myths multiplied. Then scientists read the one archive that cannot lie, his DNA. What surfaced was not a curse, but something colder and more human, power arranged against biology, a dynasty tightening its blood until it broke. If the treasures showed how Egypt wanted to be remembered, the genome shows how it actually lived and died. Ready to see how a glittering legend unravels when the evidence is written inside the bones? The tomb that rewrote Egypt. In 1922, Howard Carter pressed his eye to a candlelit hole in the sealed doorway of KV 62 and whispered that he saw wonderful things. Shrines nested like gilded seashells. Chariots leaned against walls. Alabaster vessels glowed pale as the moon. And at the center waited the face that would mesmerize the 20th century. A mask of gold, lapis, glass, and flawless craft. Tutankhamun's burial was modest in size compared with grander kings, yet uniquely intact, a time capsule that preserved the choreography of royal afterlife with breathtaking fidelity. The antechamber overflowed with daily tools cast in precious materials, beds, stools, bows, board games, objects meant to make eternity feel familiar. In the treasury, a jackal statue watched over canopic shrines. In the burial chamber nested coffins and a sarcophagus, so tightly sealed with resin that even modern blades struggled. The world saw splendor. Egyptologists saw data. Every artifact could be read like a sentence, and together they formed a library. The early autopsy culture complicated the picture. Carter's team, working with the tools of the day, used heat to loosen resin and disassembled the mummy to free it from the sarcophagus, leaving a trail of damage that later clouded interpretation. A fracture at the back of the skull, broken ribs, detached limbs, each artifact became the seed of a sensational theory. Murder, a palace coup, a chariot crash. For decades, the gleam of treasure cast long shadows where speculation could flourish. But a century of new techniques, high-resolution photography, CT scanning, residue analysis, would recast that drama. The most unsettling truths were not about curses or assassins. They were about biology. Carter's notes captured small, human textures that the headlines skipped. Fingerprints in resin, linen creases preserved like ripples on a pond, a lock of hair tucked inside a miniature coffin, lists of walking sticks annotated for height and balance, an ivory inlay repaired in antiquity with deft, nearly invisible glue. These are the kinds of details that turn a museum into a diary. Even the layout, annex jammed with provisions, treasury thick with ritual models, antechamber crowded with daily life, reads as a map of priorities. The boy king was furnished less like a conqueror and more like a patient wrapped in care and continuity. That impression would quietly bloom into a thesis when medicine entered the room. As Egypt woke to the discovery, another story rode in its wake. Fear. Carnarvon's death from infection and a string of illnesses among visitors incubated the curse, a narrative that says more about modern appetite than ancient intent. The Egyptians believed in reciprocity, not vendetta. Feed the gods and the dead, and they sustain you. Neglect them, and order decays. Ironically, the curse kept the world staring, which means the boy's short life began shaping lives again. But spectacle delays scholarship. It would take laboratory light, not candlelight, to show why Tutankhamun's reign was so brief and his body so fragile. The twist that follows is quieter than myth and far more disturbing. Death myths, medical clues. Legends prefer a single blow. Biology usually prefers a tangle. When modern CT scans mapped the boy king, the glamour peeled away. The bones showed a clubfoot and curler disease of the navicula, a fragile mid-foot bone. The spine curved, knees hinted at chronic stress. These were not the markers of a fearless charioteer. They were the accommodations of a limping adolescent who likely leaned on the elegant canes buried around him. More than one cane, in fact, dozens, many polished by use. Meanwhile, molecular testing found DNA fragments from malaria parasites, the sort of invisible enemy that could humble even a robust adult, let alone a teenager with orthopedic issues and possible immune compromise. Each new scan and assay shaved the edges off grand theories. The picture sharpened into something painfully ordinary. A young man navigating real, grinding ailments in a court built for spectacle. Yet evidence also absolved a favourite rumour. The skull fracture that launched 1,000 whodunits likely occurred after death, either from Carter's heated extraction or resin contraction. Broken ribs line up better with mummy handling than with a battlefield catastrophe. The CT data forced an uncomfortable pivot. The young pharaoh did not die in operatic fashion. He failed in slow motion. Why was Tutankhamun so fragile to begin with? Egypt built stone dreams and irrigated empires. How did the center produce a child so compromised? The pathology list can sound clinical until you remember the person. Imagine the throne room, a teenager balancing regal bearing and literal weight shift, choosing ceremonial postures that ease pressure on a tender foot. Imagine the hunt scenes not as personal exploits, but as propagandistic theatre, a court that knows its king's limits, staging vitality in paint and precious metal. Those elegant bows and chariots may have been handled more by instructors and guards than by the king. None of this makes him smaller. If anything, it makes him braver. A boy asked to embody a god while negotiating pain and infection. Malaria adds another layer, visible as parasite DNA in tissue and as bone changes compatible with anemia. The Nile's gifts included mosquitoes. In a palace with pools and gardens, exposure would be constant. Combine infection with skeletal stress, and the prognosis narrows. A minor fracture, a fever spike, a systemic cascade. There are many mundane ways for a compromised body to fail. We prefer operas. Biology delivers prose. Technology also cleaned the lens. CT stacks allowed virtual unwrapping without harm. Radiologists mapped densities down to millimeters, reconstructing posture, injuries, even the resin pools that once hid features. The image of a dramatic blow gave way to resin slump and post-mortem artifact. It is less cinematic and more credible. And the question it hands to history is colder. In a palace designed to win, how did no one see the genetic trap closing? Inside the Amarna web, Akhenaten, the heretic king, attempted a revolution that recentered Egypt around one god, Aten, the solar disk. Temples were shuttered, priesthoods defunded, and a new capital, Akhetaten, rose in desert light. Art changed too. Soft bodies, elongated skulls, intimate scenes of family beneath sun rays ending in tiny hands. In that climate, Tutankhaten was born. When the religious experiment fractured the state, the child was repositioned as cure. Temples reopened, Amun rose again, and the king's name bent to Tutankhamun. That pivot was not just liturgical, it was political triage, a court stitching together institutions with symbolism and ceremony. Monuments hinted and obscured in equal measure. Nefertiti dazzled the era, but may not be the boy's mother. Inscriptions praised Aten's light, then scratched it out when the restoration arrived. Through the noise, one constant held. The court preferred to solve political risk by narrowing the circle of blood. That decision leaves a signature. It hides in faces on colossi and in epithets on stellae, but it speaks loudest in the quiet code of chromosomes. As researchers planned the first comprehensive attempt to read royal genomes, The Amarna household looked less like a family tree and more like a braid. To grasp the trap, follow the incentives. The ideology of divine kingship discouraged dilution. A god's son marries a god's daughter to keep divinity undivided. Authority becomes a family business in the most literal sense. Add geopolitical stress, foreign powers probing borders, priesthoods resisting austerity, famine years demanding certainty, and elites reach for the most controllable lever: kinship. Brother-sister unions signal purity to the temples and continuity to the army. They also double the odds that two carriers hand a harmful allele to a child. In a few generations, luck turns into law. The restoration that renamed Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun was also a restoration of institutional memory. Old priesthoods returned to payroll. Towns reopened their cults. The boy king's edicts read like apologies to the gods his father offended. Yet the domestic sphere kept narrowing. His queen, Tutankhamun, was likely his half-sister. Two tiny mummies in the tomb, fetuses around 25 and 37 weeks, testify to pregnancies that failed. X-rays and CT images show severe congenital anomalies. In other words, the household story and the medical story rhyme. Amarna art, with its intimate kisses and elongated forms, has long divided viewers. Some see realistic tenderness, some see stylization, some see pathology implied in skull shapes and hips. DNA reframes the debate. Whatever aesthetic choices artists made, the household they decorated lived at odds with its own body. That tension explains both the urgency of restoration and the brittleness of succession. When ideology and biology collide, compromise often arrives as crisis. Reading a pharaoh's genome, ancient DNA work, is a discipline of paranoia in service of confidence. Teams built sterile laboratories, UV-bombed benches, masked staff, and drilled procedures to treat every sample as a crime scene. From Tutankhamun and putative relatives, they harvested bone deep from dense tissue, where contamination is least likely. They authenticated sequences by looking for telltale DNA damage, cytosine deamination patterns at molecule ends, and they replicated results across independent extractions and labs. They grounded claims in short tandem repeat profiles, mitochondrial haplotypes, and Y chromosome markers, cross-checking every inference against archaeology and history. Only then did they sketch a tree. The tree that best fit the evidence shocked lay audiences but made brutal sense to geneticists. The mummy identified as Akhenaten patterns as Tutankhamun's father. The younger lady patterns as both Akhenaten's full sister and Tutankhamun's mother. In plainer terms, the boy king was the product of a brother-sister union. That finding isn't a tabloid twist. It's a dynasty's standard operating procedure visible at last. Medical correlations lined up. Close kin mating elevates the chance that recessive harmful variants will pair. Skeletal anomalies, immune fragility, and prenatal losses track with that risk. The genome didn't prove every symptom, but it explained the pattern. Sampling royal mummies was controversial, and rightly so. Collectors once hacked amulets from wrappings. No one wants a return to that era. The teams published protocols in painful detail. Which bones, what drill bits, how many picograms, how to authenticate reads, how to share data for replication. They registered alleles linked to bone necrosis risks and blood group markers. They cross-checked kinship coefficients using autosomal STRS and Y chromosome haplotypes. They tested mitochondrial sequences to place maternal lines. The point wasn't spectacle, it was auditability. Anyone with the training could critique the methods instead of the headlines. One of the odd gifts of a DNA is time travel for microbes. From Tutankhamun and relatives, researchers amplified sequences from Plasmodium falciparum. consistent with malaria infections. They did not find evidence for leprosy or plague. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, but the pathogen profile fits a subtler, pervasive stress rather than a single cataclysm. Combined with skeletal findings, the boy's clinical picture emerges. Congenital foot disorder, possible immune stress from inbreeding, episodic fevers, and a body that could be tipped into crisis by a common infection. For the public, the headline was incest. For historians, the headline was method. Egyptology had leaned on texts and stones. Now, molecules joined the archive. The merger is powerful. Genealogies once inferred from cartouches could be confirmed or corrected. Claims about ethnicity could be kept in their lane. Ancient population structure is not a proxy for modern identity politics. And most importantly, a child who died 3,000 years ago could be seen not only as a symbol, but as a patient. The terrifying cost of sacred blood. Terrifying here is not horror movie supernatural. It is the cold arithmetic of heredity enforced by theology. Divine kingship encouraged the palace to fold in upon itself. Political continuity improved. Biological resilience declined. Across history, elites that incubate within narrow gene pools pay a price. Habsburg prognathism, Victorian haemophilia, isolated island disorders. In the Amarna case, the bill appears as a limping king, two non-viable daughters interred with their father, and a succession crisis that invited strongmen to write the ending. The genome did not curse Tutankhamun. The palace did, gently and with the best of intentions. Artifacts read differently through this lens. The canes are not props for ceremony alone. They are durable medical devices. The lavish sandals include pairs sized to accommodate an uneven gait. The relatively modest tomb begins to look like the hurried solution to a death that arrived sooner than planners expected. Even the famous mask shifts registers, from invincible icon to compassionate prosthetic, a perfected face placed over a life constrained by choices he did not make. The terror, then, is double. It is the private terror of a child heir asked to perform divinity while nursing pain, and the public terror of a state that gambled its future on the narrowing spiral of blood purity. Consider succession after the death. I and Horemheb, senior figures in court and military, stepped into vacuum. Their monuments rewrite the story with themselves at the center, as victors do. But the genetic reading tells the subtext. The royal line had thinned to threads. Ankhesenamun's desperate letter to a Hittite king, begging for a foreign prince to marry her so Egypt would not hand the throne to a servant, was a political Hail Mary from a queen who knew biology had cornered her. The prince sent was murdered en route. The dynasty dissolved into the arms of men who could stabilize the state, if not the bloodline. Terrifying also describes how easily splendor hides fragility. Visitors file past the Golden Shrine and think power. Few think prenatal medicine. They see canopic jars and think ritual. Few think of hereditary risk counseling that never existed. Tutankhamun's story, therefore, isn't an indictment of Egypt. It is a mirror held to any system that confuses purity with strength. Close loops of blood, of ideas, of allies feel safe until stress arrives. Then redundancy, diversity, and open exchange reveal themselves as the true engines of survival. The boy king's genome simply inscribed that lesson where we could read it. If this sounds modern, it is. Corporations inbreed strategies, communities close ranks, algorithms train on themselves. Tutankhamun reminds us, closed circuits can light brilliantly for a moment, then burn out. What we know, what we don't, why it matters. The DNA studies drew criticism, as serious work should. Ancient DNA fragments, contamination stalks every step. Population labels are easily abused. The research answered narrow questions, first-degree kinship, medical plausibility, and refused bait on modern identity politics. That restraint is a feature, not a flaw. Within scope, replication and damage authentication support the core claims. Akhenaten as father, a full sister as mother, a health profile consistent with inbreeding plus infection. Beyond scope, rhetoric gets risky. Grand claims about race or destiny crumble under scrutiny. Why it matters reaches past Egyptology. We learn how symbols can outrun bodies, how rituals of purity can engineer fragility, how power can mistake enclosure for safety. Museum narratives evolve too. A room once staged as glitter and curse now includes mobility aids, prenatal loss, and clinical context. The wonder is undiminished. It is grounded. Ethically, Tutankhamun's genome set precedents. Minimize sampling, publish methods, cohere archaeology with biology, and treat human remains as persons, not datasets. That standard has already lifted debates about sampling other royal lineages and ordinary burials alike. So where does the story go next? Deeper sequencing may refine the kinship web. Pathogen DNA may map epidemic histories. Isotope chemistry may track diet and movement. But the central warning will not change. When authority insists that legitimacy equals blood made purer by closeness, biology keeps the receipts and presents the bill to children. Skeptics asked whether the younger lady is truly Akhenaten's sister. After all, titles could be elastic, and mummies migrate in caches. The counter is cumulative, matching STRS, mitochondrial concordance, tomb provenance, and converging phenotypes across scans. None of this is courtroom proof beyond any doubt. It is scientific proof beyond reasonable doubt, and it points in one direction. Other concerns focused on contamination. Here again, labs leaned on characteristic DNA damage patterns and independent replication. The argument has matured from "is it possible" to "is it probable?" And within that frame, the conclusions hold. One ethical anxiety remains productive: how to tell this story without weaponizing it. Modern racists love to conscript mummies. Serious researchers, by contrast, keep population genetics historically grounded and resist anachronism. Tutankhamun's genome can refine his family tree and his clinic. It cannot validate modern fantasies about ownership of antiquity. For museums and classrooms, the payoff is richer empathy. Teachers can now juxtapose mask and scan, hymn and haplotype, throne and cane. How did theological certainty shape bedroom politics? How did malaria alter geopolitics by weakening a king? How did a single tomb, accidentally spared, distort our view of a whole era? Those questions matter because they scale. States, companies, and families still choose between purity and capacity, between myth and measurement. Egypt's most famous child makes the stakes visible. Gold can dazzle, but DNA doesn't lie. Tutankhamun's genome turned a legend into a lesson about power, purity, and the hidden price of keeping a dynasty perfect. If a single strand of ancient code can rewrite an entire chapter of history, what other sacred stories will crack under the microscope? Drop your take below. Medical tragedy, political design, or something we still haven't considered. And if you want more myth versus evidence deep dives, jaw-dropping discoveries, clean science, zero fluff, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and share this with the friend who still thinks curses explain everything. We're not done digging.